Okay. So, yes, we are starting our discussion on factor markets starting today. And this is going to be like some part of it is going to be similar to what we have already discussed with regards to product market, but some of it might be different. And also, this is like one of the only longer topics that we have yet to cover before we finish with micro, really. So we're almost at the end line. And after we've covered factor markets, we have externalities and public goods to talk about. And I think that's basically it. And we're done with micro. Okay. So factor markets, they're also known as resource market or input markets. They basically mean the same thing. So when we talk about factor markets, so I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the product market and like helping you understand what the difference between the product market versus factor market is. So just to get that out of the way and lay the foundation to move forward. So product markets, and this is where we have focused most of our time up until now in micro. Product markets is where households buy goods and services produced and sold by farms. Okay, so any kind of consumer goods that you can think about, right? Pizza, Apple, computers, right? So in terms of any of these goods that we buy and sell, households were the buyers of these goods and services. Okay, so households were the buyers of goods and services, so they're on the demand side. So they were the we will talk about them as the demanders. Okay, and farms or businesses were the sellers of these goods and services. Okay, so they were on the supply side. Okay, so those, as we will see, this is very different from how it is in the factor market. Okay, so resource markets or factor markets is when households provide farms. So provide means supply, right? So households are actually doing the supplying here. They supply farms with factors of production, and we'll see this in a little bit what these factors of production are, and maybe you remember some of them from way back in the beginning. So households in factor markets, households are the one doing the supplying, so they provide or supply farms or businesses with the factors of productions that the farms or businesses will then use to produce goods and services. So it's not like they're interrelated, right? The product markets and the factor markets, they're related to each other because farms, right, in order to produce goods and services, they need to buy these factors of production, and they buy them from the households. And only if households provide them to the farms can then use these factors of production to produce the goods and services that are then going to be bought by the households in the product market. Okay, so here households are the sellers of factors of production, so they are the suppliers, and farms are the buyers, or they're on the demand side of the factor market. Okay, so this is one of the big distinctions between product market and factor markets, is that the role of households and farms are now reversed. Okay, hi Frida, can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah, so you just came in. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to what I was just saying. So um, we started our discussion of factor markets today, and basically I was just giving Joseph an overview of how the factor market is different than the product market. The product market is what we have seen up until now when we talked about supply and demand for things, goods such as like pizza, Apple, computer, any kind of goods that households buy and farms sell, right, are in the product market. And the factor market is, the reversal of that picture, because this is where households provide farms with factors of production. So these things, as we will see in the next slide, labor, land, capital. So households own these factors of production, and they will be supplying these factors of production to businesses or farms so that they can use these factors of production to produce goods and services. Okay, so just to make sure that you understand that the demand side and the supply side are now different from product market. Okay, any question?
No.
Okay, great. So the factors of production, that what are these factors of productions that are being bought and sold in the factor market? So households, as we just said, households are the ones that are offering these factors of production to businesses or farms so that they can use them to make goods and services. So these are the four factors of productions that we have talked about before. Right, so labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. So labor, just basically means physical labor, mental labor, any kind of having to do with workers. Basically, land, is so labor, workers, physical labor or mental labor. Land is any kind of natural resource that you can use to make other things, wood, minerals, timbers, anything that is available in nature that we can use to make other things. Capital, we said that, it's some things like tools, machines, buildings, and other structures. So manufacture goods that we can then use to make goods and services. Okay. And entrepreneurship is basically someone who combines these three other factors of production and make something. So they will start a business, they will assume risks for that business, and they will combine all of these other things to make something new. Okay. And then farms, have to get these factors of production from households, right? But they don't get them for free, of course. They have to pay a price to hire or to get each one of these factors. So these are the different factor payments for the different factors. So for the factor payment for labor, we call them wages. So it's basically the price that farms have to pay in order to hire labor. The price that farms have to pay in order to get hire or rent land is called rent. The price that farms have to pay in order to get capital from households is called interest. Okay. And the factor payment for entrepreneurship would be profit. And these prices, okay, just like we saw in the product market, the price of goods and services are determined by the market forces of supply and demand. It works the exact same way in the factor market. The prices of these factors are determined entirely by the market demand and the market supply of resources or factors. Okay. Any questions so far?
Oh.
Then let's talk a little bit about the circular flow model, which is something that we saw, I think on the very first lecture for micro. when we were trying to understand economic thinking, I introduced this model to you guys, but that was a long time ago. And this model is a good example of, or not, it's a good model to recap and try to understand it better, because as you can see here, the two entities that we are mostly concerned with are households and farms or businesses. And then there are two types of markets here. One is the product market and one is the factor market. So of course, up until now, we've mostly been focusing on the product market, where farms sell goods and services and households buy. But now we're going to focus on this portion, which is the factor market, where farms are going to be buying factors from households. So they're interconnected. In for the economy to function, we need both of these markets to work. Okay, and basically, the circular flow model shows us the flow of inputs and outputs throughout the economy, and also how money flows throughout the economy. So the flow of dollars. So the dashed arrows represent how inputs and outputs flow, and the solid arrows are how the money is flowing around the economy, going from one entity to another, and how that works. Okay, so as you can imagine, so let's start at the product, or let's start with the flow of inputs and outputs. Okay, so farms are the ones that sell goods and services in the product market, and households are the ones that buy these goods and services also in the product market. So goods and services are bought and sold in the product market. Okay, households also sell something to farms, okay, which are the factors of production. So households sell labor, land, capital, entrepreneurship, all these factors of production to farms in the factor market. Okay, and farms will then use these factors of production, okay, to make the goods and services that they can sell in the product market. So it's one loop, right? um, Something that the farms would not be able to make these goods and services without buying factors of production from households. And the same way, households wouldn't be able to buy anything if farms weren't selling goods and services in the product market. Okay, and then the other thing is the flow of money, how money flows around the economy. So when households, we're gonna start with the let's start with the farms again. So farms, right, when they obtained factors of production from households, right, they don't get them for free, like we just mentioned. So they have to pay households factor payments, right, which are wages, rent, profit, and interest. Okay, interest for capital. So they have to make these factor payments to households, right? So these payments, if that the farms are making to households, become income for households. Okay, so for someone who's selling labor, they get wages and that's their income. For someone who has a land to rent, they're gonna make some income from renting that land. So when farms make those factor payments, that becomes income for households. Households then spend those incomes in the product market, okay, to buy goods and services that farms are selling. And when households spend the money to buy the goods and services that farms are producing and selling, that then becomes revenue for the farms. Okay, so the income that the households are spending in the product market becomes the revenue that farms gain from selling the goods and services in the product market. Okay, so if you the money sort of just goes around and around, right? It just changes hand. It's a closed system. Nothing is coming from outside. It's just that money changes hand, and then inputs and outputs flow from one market to another. Okay, so if anything, this model or this diagram should really tell you how important it is, like how interconnected and these two markets are with each other. Okay, and why is it that we need to now take a little bit of a look or examine the factor market? Okay, any question here?
No.
Then, so we're going to talk about the perfectly competitive labor market. So I know we talked about four different factors of production: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. But for the purposes of this class and to begin with, we're going to focus on one of those factors, which is labor. And we we start with we start with talking about the perfectly competitive labor market, but later on we're also going to take a look at labor market that not might not be perfectly competitive, that might have imperfect competition. Okay, so what are some characteristics or assumptions that we make about this perfectly competitive labor market? So first thing, if it is perfectly competitive, it means that it is comprised of many small farms. Okay, and they're hiring many workers that have identical skills and abilities. Okay, so there are many small farms that are hiring workers, and those workers have identical skills and abilities. So as you can imagine, this is probably not related to highly skilled workers. So we're not talking about surgeons. We're not talking about dentists or doctors. So this basically refers to like low skilled workers, where you don't really need to have a lot of skills and abilities to do the work. And just as we saw with perfectly competitive product markets, right? We saw that perfectly competitive product markets, the farms were price takers. Okay, and it's the same idea here. Here, the farms are known as so because there are so many small farms that are hiring so many workers, and each farm is so small that they only hire a small portion, okay, of the industry, of the total workers that are in the industry. So no one farm is really large enough to have any influence in the market. Okay, so it's not like they have any market power. So in this sense, it's very similar to the perfectly competitive product market that we talked about. Um, and wage, right? So wage is what? So wage is the price of labor. Okay, so it's the factor payments for hiring labor. So the price of labor is constant, and it is determined by the market demand and market supply of labor. So if you think about the perfectly competitive product market that we saw, it looked something like this, right? So this was the supply, this was the demand, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of goods and services that is going to be bought and sold was determined by the forces of supply and demand. Okay, and so this was the market, and the price that was determined at the market, right? This was the market price that was determined by the market was sort of a set price, and individual farms in perfect competition, like perfectly competitive product market, they sort of had to take this price as given, right? So we just sort of extended this price, so we assumed that these individual farms were price takers. So their demand curve was a perfectly elastic demand curve, and price was equal to marginal revenue. And then they had marginal cost curve that looked like this, and then at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost was the profit maximizing quantity. But the idea here is that the wage, the price was determined at the market, and individual farms had to accept that price as given. They could sell as much as they want at this market price. They couldn't raise their price, and they had no reason to lower the price. So this is a very similar idea that we're exploring here with the perfectly competitive labor market. The only difference here is that um, the farms, right, they are no longer on the selling side or the supply side. Now they are the on the demand side, right? So they are the ones hiring the workers, and the workers are the uh, are on the supply side. Okay, so what do we mean by individual farms are wage takers? Okay, so what we mean by that, by this, is that just like we saw with perfectly competitive product market, um, this same idea applies. So this is the product market. Okay, so I'll just rewrite this. So like this is product market. This is, as we know, supply and demand, price and quantity. But for the perfectly competitive labor market, right, factor market, individual farms here are also wage takers, which means that farms can hire as many workers as they want at the wage that is set by the industry. So the wage, remember, is just like price in perfectly competitive product market. The wage for perfectly competitive labor market is also set. So this is W star, this would be like L. Okay, so this is the labor market, the perfectly competitive labor market. So this is what the labor market graph looks like. The intersection of supply of labor and demand of labor gives us an equilibrium wage rate. Okay, and how many quantities of workers are going to be hired at that wage rate. That is what the intersection of supply and demand tells us in the labor market. Okay, so individual farms, so this is the market graph. So as you can imagine, there would be a graph for the farm over here too, and it's going to look a little bit different. But the only sort of interesting thing here is that individual farms are also wage takers. So they can hire as many workers as they want at this market wage rate that is set by the industry. Okay, they don't have to raise wages in order to attract more workers, but they can hire as many as they want at this wage rate. Okay, but they don't need to raise wages either in order to attract workers, because they can basically, they just don't have any reason, because they can hire as many as they want at this market rate, and they wouldn't lower the wage. They wouldn't be able to lower the wage because there are many other farms who would actually be offering the market wage. So if you are a farm and you're trying to lower the wage, then the market wage, the workers would just go to somebody else who's going to be offering them at least the market wage rate. Okay, so this is sort of a side-by-side comparison of the perfectly competitive product market and the perfectly competitive labor market. So we have, the product market, we have price on the price on the vertical axis, the price of the good or this, product that is being sold, and then the quantity of the good, so on the horizontal axis, and then the supply and demand, and their interaction, the intersection of supply and demand gives us an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity of the product. And similarly, this is we have a perfectly competitive labor market graph, and what we have on the vertical axis is the price of labor. So the price of labor, once again, is the wage, right? Because this is, as we just saw, this is what farms have to pay workers in order to hire them, right? So which is the price of labor is known as wage. Okay, and on the horizontal axis we have the quantity of labors that is going to be hired. Okay, and the intersection of supply of labor and demand for labor gives us the equilibrium wage rate and how many workers are going to be hired, right? This is the L star. Okay. Do you guys have any questions so far? Hello? Elias, how are you feeling? So, because you weren't here from the very beginning, is there anything that you didn't understand?
No, I'm very good. I just wanted, like, I just wanted to know what's the topic of today's lesson.
So we're talking about factor markets. Okay. So we started talking about factor markets. So I started by talking a little bit about the difference between product markets and factor markets. So remember, or just to recap, product market is what we have been focusing most of our time in economics so far. When we have talked about supply and demand, for goods and services, and we saw shifts of supply and demand and all that. So what we were looking at, that was the product market. Okay, so the product market is when households buy goods and services that are produced and sold by farms. So in the product markets, households are on the demand side, and they're buying goods and services, and farms were the sellers and they were selling goods and services. So they were on the supply side. The factor market is the reversal, okay, where households provide farms with factors of production, which are labor, land, capital, these factors of production that households own, and they will offer to farms or businesses so that they can use these factors of production to produce goods and services. So here, households are no longer on the demand side. They're actually the sellers of factors of production. So they're on the supply side. And farms are the buyers of factors of production, and they are now on the demand side. Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we were just, getting a little bit into, more of this factor market discussion. Okay. So then we talked about the circular flow model a little bit, just to show how these two markets are related and, really interconnected and interrelated with each other, and you can't really have one without the other. Okay.
Okay.
Then I talked about the perfectly competitive labor market, and how the basically the intersection, or the market forces of supply and demand for labor is also going to determine. So just like in product market, it was, where supply and demand intersect, that gives you the equilibrium price. So in the product market, it's the same idea here in the labor market, where the supply of labor and demand of labor, these two curves intersect with each other. That's where we're going to get the equilibrium wage rate, and how many quantities of workers is going to be hired at this equilibrium wage rate. So then now we're gonna, so we just took a look at these two graphs side by side, the perfectly competitive product market and factor market. And the only difference here is that the vertical axis stands for something else. In the factor market, it's no longer price of the good and then the quantity of the good. It's the price of labor, which is wage, and quantity of labor. Okay.
Okay.
Then let's talk a little bit about what we mean by demand for labor. Okay, and demand for labor and supply of labor and what all those things mean. So demand for labor is basically the different quantities of workers that businesses are going to be willing and able to hire at different wages. That is all that we mean by there being a demand for labor. Okay, so what we see here is that the demand for labor is inversely related to the price of labor. Okay, so the price of labor, recall that this is the wage is the price of labor. This is what farms, this is also known as the factor payment. So this is what farms have to pay to workers, which is wage. Okay, so the price of labor is wage, and then the quantity of labor is on the horizontal axis. And what we see here is that the demand curve for labor is a downward sloping line, right? And it looks like it is inversely related to the price of labor, which means that at higher wages, as wages increase, farms demand less labor. But when wages decrease, right, at W2, the quantity of labor demanded is L2, right, which is higher than L1. So when wages decrease, the quantity demanded increases, and when wages increase, the quantity demanded decreases. Okay, so what is the quantity demanded? Is the quantity demanded is the number of workers, right? Quantity demanded of labors. So basically, there is an inverse relationship between the price of labor and the quantity demanded of labor. Okay, that makes intuitive sense to us, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So then there is another thing that we have to talk about, which is the marginal revenue product of labor. So this is something, the farm's demand for labor is based on this thing called the marginal revenue product of labor, and it has it tells us about something um, else that is also interesting. Okay, so let's find out what we mean by this marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so as you can, well, the name should tell you, a few things, right? The marginal meaning additional, and then revenue product of labor. So, it's all these things. Like it's not something that is like radically new to us. So as you will see, like the definition is not something that is like, I don't know where it came from. Okay, so for businesses, right, if you are deciding how many workers you need to hire for your business, right, for your outputs that you need to produce, like I am going to need this many workers. So in order for you to decide, or what really decides how many workers you're going to hire, you basically first need to determine the value of hiring an additional worker. So how many workers I'm going to hire depends on the value that these additional workers are going to bring to me. Okay, so technically, or like as a definition, the marginal revenue product of labor is basically just the addition to a farm's revenue when they hire an additional worker. Okay, so it the shorthand for the marginal revenue product of labor is going to be this MRPL. So it's basically the change in the total revenue for a farm divided by the change in labor. Okay, it's as simple as that. So how much does my total revenue change when I hire an additional worker? Or how much additional revenue is the next worker going to bring, or going to bring to my firm? So if it goes like this, the change in total revenue divided by the change in total labor, okay, we can like tweak this notation a little bit to give us something that we are more familiar with. Okay, so if I do this, if I bring in change in quantity, multiply it, and then divide by it, okay, basically these things cancel each other out, and I have the same basic formula that I started with, but by doing this, by introducing these two things, I have something that I know I'm familiar with. This should look familiar to all of you, basically. So the change in total revenue, when I produce an additional unit of output, or when I sell an additional unit of output, what is the change in total revenue if I sell one more? What do we know that as? Anybody?
What?
This term right here, the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, does this look familiar?
Yes, that's marginal revenue.
Yes, exactly. So that's marginal revenue, right? It's how much does my total revenue change when I sell one more unit of output. So that's your marginal revenue. And this is also something that we know and have talked about. It might not look so familiar right now because it was a long time ago, but this is known as the marginal product of labor, which is basically saying, if I hire an additional worker, right, how much does my total output change? So what is the addition to my total output, right? What is the change to my total output by hiring one more worker? So that is basically your marginal product of labor. So MRPL is just this, the product of marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Okay? And now let's take a look at what it looks like on a table, because sometimes numbers tell us, or help us understand things better than just formulas. So let's say here we're imagine that we're talking about a bakery, okay, and they produce loaves of bread, and this bakery can hire from anywhere from 0 to 6 workers. And this column right here is the total product. So if you haven't hired anybody, the total product is 0. The first worker makes 6 total loaves of bread. 2 workers together, they produce 11 loaves of bread. 3 workers together, they produce 15, and on like that. The marginal product of labor is basically the change in the total product of labor, right? Or the change in total product divided by the change in labor. Okay, so we use quantity and total product synonymously, but they mean the same thing, right? How much does my output change when I increase, or when I hire an additional worker? So as you hopefully know by now, right, we do this just by the marginal product of labor, right, for the first worker is just we subtract the total product, right, from the for total product for the first worker, and subtract from that the total product if there were 0 workers, so that's basically 0, and then the change in labor, which is 1 minus 0. So that's for the first worker. Okay, so it's 6. And we do the same thing. So because this change in labor is always going to be 1, so all you really need to do is look at the change in total product from hiring, going from 1 worker to 2 workers. So it's 11 minus 6, which is 5. Going from 2 to 3, it's 15 minus 11, which is 4. So this is basically what this marginal product column is showing us. Okay, with me so far, you guys?
Yeah, but why is always marginal revenue 2?
Sorry, here?
Why is marginal revenue always equal to 2?
Okay, so this is what I'm getting to right now. So remember, we were talking about, we assumed that we're talking about a perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so that is on the factor side, right? So we assume that we're talking about a perfectly competitive labor market. But the other thing we're going to assume here is that we also have a perfectly competitive product market, which means that we have, so this is the, if we assume the perfectly competitive product market, so this is the market graph, right? So this is P star, this is Q star, supply, demand. And remember, on the farm side, this is their price takers. So, they also have this, they just take this P star as given, and they have a perfectly elastic demand curve. And what do I do? Okay. Okay. So remember, farms here are price takers. In perfectly competitive product market, they're price takers, which means that they have to accept the market price as given. And this is because this price is constant, it's fixed. What we remember from perfect competition is that their marginal revenue is equal to their price, because each time they sell one more unit of output, recall that the additional revenue that they can earn is always going to be equal to the price. Remember? Recall this, or does this ring any bell from before? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, so this is why the marginal revenue is equal to price, and it's always 2. It's because, apart from assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive labor market, we are also assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive product market. So this is why this thing also holds, where the marginal revenue is equal to price, and it's a constant number. Okay? So then we found the marginal product of labor, we found the marginal revenue, which is equal to price, and now we have no problem calculating this thing that we basically need to get at, which is the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so this is all really that farms care about. They care about how much additional revenue and worker is going to bring to the farm. Okay, so they want to calculate this. And the way we get this is by, recall that, the marginal revenue product of labor is just MPL times P, or, MPL times MR, but MR is equal to P here. So, MPL times P or MPL times MR is the same thing. Okay? Then this is what we get. It's 6 times 2 is 12, 5 times 2 is equal to 10, 4 times 2 is equal to 8, 3 times 2 is equal to 6, 2 times 2 is equal to 4, 1 times 2 is equal to 2. So this is the marginal revenue product of labor associated with each different quantity of labor. Okay. Basically, what this, like, why we care about this is that if you imagine being the first worker, okay, the first worker can make the marginal product, right, for the first worker is 6. So he is adding 6 additional loaves of bread, right, to the total product per hour. Okay, so his marginal product of labor is 6, and we can sell those, we can sell per loaf of bread for $2. Okay, so basically the additional revenue that he is earning the farm is $12 per hour. Okay, because he is adding, right, he's adding 6 loaves of bread per hour to the total product, and we can sell each loaf of bread for $2. So the additional revenue he is earning for the farm is $12. And this $12 is the maximum amount that the farm would be willing to pay to hire that first worker. Okay, so to hire first worker, farm would be willing to pay maximum of $12. So as you can imagine, okay, this is, if they're willing to pay this much, this is the wage that they would be willing to pay to hire that first worker, because $12 is what they are contributing to the farm's revenue per hour. Okay, and if you take a look at us going down, okay, for the second worker, his marginal revenue product is less than the first worker, and therefore his marginal revenue product of labor is also less than the first worker. So to hire the second worker, the farm would only be willing to pay him something like $10. Okay, they wouldn't pay anything more than $10 to hire that second worker. And same thing for the third worker. His marginal product is even less than the second worker, and his marginal revenue product, right, for the same reason, is also less than the previous two workers. So the most that the farm would be willing to pay to hire that third worker is $8. So as you can see from here, right, if we plot this marginal revenue product of labor against quantity of labor, as we have done here in this graph, the MRPL basically is equal to the wage rate, right? Because 12, 10, 8, these are the maximum that the farms would be willing to pay to hire the worker respectively. So $12 maximum to hire that first worker, $10 maximum to hire the second worker, $8 maximum to hire the third worker. So basically, this is the same thing as the demand for labor. Okay, the marginal revenue product of labor is the same thing as the demand for labor, because as you recall from the previous slide where we had the graph for the demand for labor, it was basically showing us the same thing, right? How many different quantities of workers farms are going to be willing to hire at different wage rates. Okay, so that was one important point of understanding, that the demand for labor is equal to the marginal revenue product labor. So you have to make sure that you know how to calculate this marginal revenue product of labor, which is basically just finding the marginal product of labor and then multiplying that by the price, okay, price of the good. Okay, do you guys have any questions, or have I lost you here completely?
No.
No.
Sure? Or I understand that this can be a little bit confusing. If there is anything that wasn't clear, I'm happy to go over it again.
No, it's okay.
Okay. All right. So this is all we're going to cover for today. So next week when we come back, we're going to look at the supply side of labor, and also the equilibrium in the labor market and all that good stuff. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.